Hello. Is that working now?
Oh yeah, it's good.
Great.
I
Perfect.
I I recognize where you are.
Yeah, it's the only place in the apartment where we have any kind of Wi-Fi. So
Yeah, yeah. But you do have, you do not have. You do have.
no, we do. Yeah, it's tolerable here, but I mean, it still runs through copper wires in Bern.
Yeah, yeah.
It's not fast. How are things?
Things are good. Yeah, it's just it's finally gotten warm here. We see spring. Things are growing. Yeah, everything is moving. Just waiting for things to kind of even out so we can start bottling some stuff.
Right.
Um,
That's a big issue
yeah,
here as well.
yeah.
All
It's
the glass and corks all very disrupted in
Yeah, yeah,
France.
for sure. If you didn't have, if I didn't have, yeah, glass and corks, yeah, it's a problem for sure. But things are happening. Things are
No,
happening.
nice.
I'm super excited to chat with you because
Hey, thanks for having me.
I mean, it's amazing when I first met you, whenever that was, I don't know, 5, 7 years ago, and to see your journey from then to now, it's incredible. It makes me happy. I listen to you, and I just it makes me happy. So I'm super excited to talk about a topic which I haven't talked about much recently because I don't I don't know, for many other reasons. I don't, there are other things like, but Burgundy, as you know, close to my heart.
Right.
Something which yeah, it's been my lifeline for the last 20 some years, and I don't get a chance. I mean, I get a chance, fair amount of chance to taste, but I do live vicariously through you because our palates are kind of similar in ways, and I love your approach for wine, all wine, and it truly, it makes me happy to talk wine with you, and today we'll discuss, and the theme of today's discussion, as I said earlier, I wanted to keep it as a kind of a younger generation, the new generation, how they're changing things in the vineyard, because I mean, Burgundy in 2020 is quite different than Burgundy in 1996 when I came here for the first time.
I can
And
only imagine. Yeah.
it's gotten better. In most ways, gotten better. For us drinkers, maybe slightly. The price point has changed quite a bit for people
Right.
who don't have the it's expensive for the most part.
For
So,
sure.
but we see on the flip side a lot of delicious wine coming out, a lot of amazing small appellations, new producers, young producers, producers from outside. So we'll discuss that. But before that, I would like maybe just take a minute of going back to your background, starting from college when I met you, and then here you are. If you can
Sure.
give us a little snapshot of that quickly, and then we move into producers and wines and stuff like that.
Right. So, I mean, we met when I was a student, and I was doing a doctorate in history at that point. I think you remember my line is that further education is the one form of institutionalized punishment where you get extra time for good behavior. So I managed to draw that out for 8 years at Oxford, running the tasting group for the majority of it. Went to California to work at Harvest, started writing for Decanter magazine, and also started working harvest in Burgundy, spending more and more time in Burgundy, writing about Burgundy then for Decanter as well as California wine, and then got the wine advocate job only 2.5 years ago now. So it's been pretty compressed trajectory, but a lot of time in wineries and vineyards, and looking now to maybe buy a few little parcels, something over here. In fact, for the future, I think it's going to be maybe the next step to learn even more about the process.
Yeah, yeah. So right now you're, of course, writing, covering Burgundy and Champagne and Beaujolais
Yep. And
for the wine advocate.
great, and let's say greater Burgundy. And I spend a lot of time in the Chardonnays,
Okay, so
Chablis, Errancy.
right.
I mean, the whole thing, not just the fact, not just sort of stopping at Chassagne and Montrachet. That's to me important. That's one of the reasons I like the theme that we've got tonight.
Yeah. And then you make a little Chenin Blanc in Northern California.
That's right. Yes.
Which is delicious.
Hey, thank you.
Really good.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's really cool. And then you also have a few parcels of vineyards.
Yeah, I buy a little bit of grapes at the moment, but I think I'd love to, just even if it's just a little half a hectare of aligoté or something would be nice. I mean, right now I'm helping manage a parcel for some friends, not people who make wine commercially or who I review, but it's really. There's no better way to learn about the reality of farming and viticulture in Burgundy than trying to see, how do you find a tâcheron who works well and will work the soils correctly, or get the vines back in health if they've been neglected. And then you really also see, you see who's using herbicides and then coming afterwards with a plow quickly to sort of scrape the surface and make it look like the vineyard's really being cultivated when it's not. I mean, you see some shocking things. And you get more attuned to the reality of what's going on and get a more global perspective than, just what we're told. Because quite often you go and taste with someone and they say, "Oh, I'm always in the vineyards," but are they? I mean, there's not. It's hard as a writer to go back and verify those kinds of pieces of information without knowing more.
Yeah. Cool. Well, it's been and you spend a lot of time. You're in Burgundy. You're right now in Beaune. I've been to your apartment right in the center of Beaune.
Stuck.
Yeah, stuck. I mean, not a bad place to be stuck.
Are the
markets open? Can you still get good cheese and bread and stuff?
Yeah, I mean, the markets are pretty shut, but you can still, most of the sort of small grocery stores are still open, and the supermarkets are still open, of course, and a lot of people who sell products normally to restaurants and things are doing like direct private sales now of the products because they have the products, they have the chickens and what have you. So there's still good stuff to eat, and the only things that have really been disrupted were white asparagus and the morel mushrooms.
Yeah.
So they were all reliant on itinerant labor to come pick them, and those folks have not come to France this year.
Yeah.
So it's not too, honestly, I really cannot complain.
Yeah, I mean it's better than being stuck in a apartment in a big building, and yeah.
Exactly, and this is the land of the bidets, so there was no shortage of lavatory paper.
Yeah. All right.
That's my theory, anyway. So thanks for having me, and thanks for the really kind words. It's a pleasure.
I truly mean it, because it's always a treat. Because I learned so much sitting around you, and because you are like you are right down on the pulse right there, and I can feel it, because every time I talk to you, there's something new. I walk away, I'm like, wow, okay, I didn't think of that. But again, asking questions in a phase of A, if you're a wine buyer, and B, or if you're like a wine producer, it's different than the questions you ask, and what you see is very, very, very interesting. So here are the wines these are among my favorite wines. I mean, anywhere, so, and some new, some, and then I'm sure you tasted other things, but Nicolas Faure,
yep.
Love the wines, and then they all are 17. This is the Gamay, which he produces. The Marseillais Claude Roy from the man Sylvain Patin. Pré-Roque. Say it again.
I've got exactly the same Patin wine. But anyway, I'll let you. Sorry.
Yeah, and then the Pré-Roque. This is the 17 Leclos. And then Chantreve, and I've Coravin them, so I'll drink them over the next few days. So I won't have to waste any of the wines. So Chantreve, Nuit Saint Georges, Damon, which is so delicious. I mean, I have to stop opening these bottles because they're so delicious right now.
Yeah.
But so these four wines I kind of select. These are truly some of favorite wines. We can discuss these and other things, and then yeah, let's what do you have open?
Well, I've got let's see, I've got the same Pattaya as you. I've got the Nuit from Nicolas. I've got a couple of wines from the Chalonnaise, and then I've got a Souchot from Anu Lachaux. So I figured we could talk about a whole range of sort of subjects coming out of that.
I visited him before this all happened, just like maybe maybe February 1st. I was there with Paul Walker and McClintock, and I couldn't find a bottle here. So so voila. But yeah, so let's talk about, like, you know, what's been happening since you've been there, and you know, you've been tasting with all the, you know, all the classic. I guess you it's hard to even differentiate old school, new school now, because everyone is kind of overlaid, and there's
honestly, yeah. And I mean, one of the things I try to avoid doing in this job is to comparing things that aren't comparable. So, I think for a long time, the way we reviewed Beaujolais historically, the way most publications reviewed Beaujolais, was to say, well, it can't get a very high score because it's not Richebourg, which never made much sense. So, and you know, that applies also to some different styles of wine, to my view, in the Côte d'Or as well. And I'm trying to avoid sort of imposing glass ceilings on things. So sometimes it's difficult to know how certain sort of styles of wine fit in the context of, you know, the Rousseaus and Rumiers of this world. But I thought it could be interesting just to sort of look at take a step back and look at the state of farming, like, generally in the Côte d'Or, which is an interesting subject, because I mean, you talked a lot about the price. Well, you mentioned the price of the wines, and it's a lot higher. And it's clear to me that the higher price of the wines today also imposes an obligation, as well as being a great advantage to growers. But it means that the farming needs to be serious. And the crazy thing, I mean, I was out in the vineyards yesterday in Pommard and Beaune, and I reckon there's more cultivated soils, non-herbicide, in Nantou, in the Haute-Côte, than there is in Beaune and Pommard, as a percentage. You know, and you look at the bottle price; those wines are all like €6.50 to €8 sort of wholesale, versus the bottle price of serious wines. So I mean, we need to see more happening. Equally, though, then you look at wines like we've got tonight, and it's incredibly inspiring to see and then talking about how things have changed since 1996. It's very inspiring to see those things happening too.
Yeah, and you know, I mean, you definitely see producers inspiring other producers, and it's definitely growing.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't compare, you know, apples and oranges for, like, you know, like, but certain styles of wine are definitely kind of. I mean, you see, like that wine shop on May Bourguignon. Like, you walk in there, and every time I walk in there, I'm like, who's that producer? Who's that producer? I like the label. You know, it's definitely growing, this kind of idea of, like, making great wine from Burgundy, and not even, like, I mean, there's a lot of Vin de France there, for example, which either didn't get appellation for one reason or the other, or maybe the person didn't even want the appellation.
Right. I mean, and I can see. I mean, I battle a lot with appellations cognitively in what I do, because they impose so many constraints on our expectations of the wines. And you know, I mean, the most revolutionary that a lot of folks get is to say, well, this is maybe misclassified. This should be Premier Cru, or this should be Grand Cru. But to me, I mean, when people ask me which you know, those sort of questions, which vineyards would you promote or which would you demote, I would much rather go to a situation which didn't have a hierarchy or classification at all. We were just talking about differences between wines, and which are better than others, perhaps, if you want to go there, which is, you know, that's a matter of taste as well. But you know, so many glass ceilings are imposed on these sort of, we talk about little appellations, but what's to say that in the current climate that that north-facing places in Arcet de Retz couldn't be some of the top sites. Huh? I mean, that's where La Luz Aligoté is.
Yeah,
that was my last vineyard walk before the quarantine. I found it.
That's right. Yeah, you sent me a picture of that. Yeah, because I mean, also the palate. It's like, I mean, I'm a diehard fanatic of Chantrelle, the wines they make, the people, everything is like, for me, they are, the most spiritual people. You get to know them, and I don't know very well, but a little bit, and you taste the wines in the last couple of years.
That's the perfume.
Yeah, but then, I mean, I won't name the name, but there's a friend of mine who's a huge Burgundy fanatic and a really good taster, and he finds them. He doesn't, he's more used to like maybe the I don't know, Rumier or Rus or whatever the case may be, and he thinks, it's not his style. So, and I'm like, okay, but the new style is, I mean, this is delicious wine. I mean, also 17 is kind of softball. It's easy, it's
for sure.
And I think smelling all these four wines in front of me, there's more similarity than differences. Of course, the terroirs are different.
Yeah, for sure.
Different texture, but they are so pure. I mean, I think
perfumed and the grain of the tannin is beautiful as well.
Yeah. It's truly, I mean. So who started this? You think, like, in your mind, like I have my thoughts of like how this era,
the sort of etiology of it. Yeah. That's an interesting question. I mean, what would be your narrative? I mean, I'm a historian by training, but I'd be very interested to hear yours.
So for me, I think the beginning was pre-Roque when Philippe Paquelet was making the wines in the early 90s. You think he made wine for like 91 to 01?
Yeah.
And that era, because you could find pre-Roque for not that much money. You could find a 99 Clos de Baz in a restaurant for a few hundred euros. I mean, no, less than 200. Back in the early 2000s, and I think Philippe Paquelet definitely kind of like, I mean, started something in the style of wine coming straight from Beaujolais, nephew of Marcel Lapierre, and then making the pre-Roque wines and then making his own wines. And I think that generation kind of started, and then you have other producers after that who some have made wine, like Derain made wines which are more on the natural side, and now you see a lot more producers making wine in that kind of I don't want to call it natural wine, but I think like they are pure.
Right.
They have more of I mean, all these wines have sulfur in them, but they are just more aromatic, and they just capture you early. You feel that you can drink it in 5 years, as opposed to like that if you age something from a great old producer, you want to keep that for a time. So.
Yeah, and I mean, I think maybe just from a technical level, there's also there's a sense in which that sort of aesthetic has maybe inspired people to, instead of sort of starting from scratch, to have taken some of the traditions of whole cluster that exist in certain parts of the Côte de Nuit and certain domains, and sort of push those further. And you can see that. I mean, you could also see that in a way what was going on at Prairie Rock was also kind of pushing further of what DRC was doing as well. And especially the wines of the mid 2000s for Imperial Rock are very much, blind tastings. You can sometimes, they can be very reminiscent of DRC wines, at least, especially the 05s.
Yeah.
So, but it was never. I mean, I don't think it's ever been an adoption of the sort of full strict carbonic, with the valve open that you find in parts of the Beaujolais, right? No one is really, none of the people whose wines we're tasting tonight have taken it in that direction at all.
Yeah, and of course we can't. We cannot forget to mention, Domaine Leroy, La Louise's influence and the style of wine, and almost like that proponent of a high level of farming and doing things. I remember when in the beginning they were, no hedging, and using
since 1999.
Higher canopy with chains, and those things are like, you're like, okay, wow, like, who's doing this? And everyone's like, oh, it's not going to work. And there were a lot of doubters, and the wines were not even like, you couldn't. And now you can find Domaine Leroy, Dauphiné wines in a few places in Burgundy. But I remember when I used to go there, and there were very few places that stocked the wines, because the wines were either in the U.S. or other parts,
or in Japan,
or in Japan, mostly in Japan.
Yeah, so, mostly Japan and U.S.
Yeah, but now, still Domaine Leroy and DRC at a textural wise, they're at a different level. But many of the wines you taste now, I think that, of course, not the same intensity, but they have more similarities with that style than not.
Oh, for sure. And if you look at someone like Bizot, that there's a very strong influence there, so at least implicitly. But no, I think for me, some of the most exciting things when you drive down the Côte today is seeing how many more people are going over to not hedging, whether it's rolling the canopies and just raising the pruning wires, or if it's échelat, which you're seeing now. Trappé just turned over all their Chambertin to échelat. So suddenly the drive from Beaune to Massenet looks really pretty different. And you have all of and you have all of Charles Lachaux's stuff in Chambord is now over to échelat, or higher training in Beaune, and then you've got Bizot with all échelat, and suddenly it's the landscape of Burgundy, and this is only in the last couple of years that this has happened, frankly. Because even before, it's even quite recent that Loire raised the canopies as high as they do now. Because it used to be a little bit more conventional, in terms of height. And same Dugapi just raised their canopies much higher in the Mazy Chambertin. So suddenly, it looks like a jungle now.
Wow. Because the thing Burgundy always, I remember I spent many summers there. I spent 2 or 3 weeks in July, and if it was a wet year, you would see how prim and proper everything was. Sometimes, I remember seeing Jean-François Coche just every day on the tractor, because I stay in Puy-Limoges, and just prim, properly trimmed. There's not one shoot. Out of, and now you see a lot more. There's a question here that's interesting. I don't know the answer. Is there anyone doing no-till in the Côte d'Or?
I think you're more likely to find that in the Haute Côte, with people being experimental in that. I haven't. There are people leaving grass between the rows, but they're working the soil once a year, probably, at least. So no one's explicitly told me that that's what they're doing. When I talk with producers, there may be people that I don't know who are who haven't told me. It does seem an interesting. Particularly with the issue with acidity, it does seem it's an interesting question, because if you're restricting the amount of nitrogen in the plant, you can have higher levels of organic acids in the fruit. It's an intriguing. I've been thinking about it a lot for these parcels that I'm looking at myself, and what's the best strategy, But it depends on where you are on the slope as well, and what kind of soils you have, I think.
And so I guess right now it's April. So is everyone finished pruning? I know that sometimes that some people are really pruned after even bud break.
I think almost everybody. I think people who didn't forget. And there are always a couple. I think people who didn't forget have pruned and attached, and everyone looks like we got away with without appreciable frost. I'd say. Yeah,
there was a little bit I saw in a few places, but nothing.
Right down on the flat, and a bit less Bourgogne. But it looks like a pretty generous potential crop. At this stage, but obviously it hasn't flowered yet, so everything can change.
Yeah. Another question: any comments on Domaine de Lambray?
Oh, well, they're going organic now, which is quite big for LVMH, you know? And in fact, Moet, you saw Moet also said they're going to stop herbicides by the end of the year. So that's huge for champagne. But I mean, I tasted you know, they obviously had this sort of revolving door situation with winemakers, and there are a lot of things that need to be done there. You know, I mean, they have a lot of Pinot Noir from the 70s, and they have some uninteresting vine genetics that were planted there in that sort of nadir of vine genetics in Burgundy. They have a lot of things. I mean, they have rotor fermenters still in the cuverie. I don't think they've used them for a few years. But I think that is an estate that, for me, I mean, you know, Lalou almost bought it. She told me. Lalou told me she was once, before the Charles Noël purchase, she was thinking of buying the Little Ombre. So imagine that's a counterfactual for you.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting. We have a couple of friends and great champagne producers. Alexander Chartonier is on here, and so
Yeah.
is Dant, and Alex is saying, you know, more evaporation from the leaves, more shade, more humidity, atmosphere, low levels of grape. And Paul Wasserman is, you know, vine density is a problem for no-till. So, yeah, I mean, you know, I guess people are doing it on a small scale, but not really kind of like, you know, I mean, I guess if it works in some places, it will, but it's not a universal idea for anyone to just adopt.
No, I think it would be tough. I mean, it would also be culturally tough because there's not, I mean, that would just go against what people have been doing so much for such a long time here.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know. But I mean, there are some people someone like Guffins down in the Mackinac only tills once a year, and only about 10 centimeters. So and after that, it's just mowing, you know. So there are people who are pushing those sort of boundaries a bit, but yeah, you don't see. I mean, you don't drive it along the coast and see much grass this time of year.
So the question here, knowing Burgundy as a whole has been changing in generation, is there a village that seems to change more?
That's an interesting question. I don't know. I mean, I think one thing that has really happened in the last 20 years, and this is writ large in the wines, is almost the breakdown of sort of village identities and the constraints and also the possibilities that villages sort of gave to people. So, I mean, if you think about how in Meursault with deep, colder cellars, there was the tradition of longer élevage, and in Pouligny, the tradition of shorter élevage and selling the wines often to the négoce, finishing them up in tank. I mean, nowadays, if you have air conditioning, you can do 24 months in Pouligny if you want to, and in Meursault, there are people doing, well, always have been doing shorter élevage, but, you know, and I think also there's sort of, in place of when back in the old days, you might have, in, say, Gevrey, if people had issues with their ferment, they would go and ask, say, Joseph Roti. And if they had issues with the ferment in Pouligny, they might ask Jean Viro or his son at Le Fleuve. You know, that those sort of village elders almost no longer. That situation doesn't really seem to exist. You have more. You have consulting enologists for sure, and we don't talk about those enough. I mean, they get a much more press in Bordeaux and the Rhone, because they have more direct dealings with the press, perhaps. But they, for sure, I mean, there are some very influential consultants in Burgundy sort of cutting across village boundaries like that. And then there are also, I mean, to me, much more interesting groups of like-minded people. Like if you look at Olivier Lamy, friends with Jean-Marc Vincent in Santenay, with Bruno Laurenson in Mercure, and you know, these guys all get together and they go, you know, you see them cycling in the vineyards together and talking about things and sharing ideas, and that, to me, you know, you get, so all those guys are doing high density plantings and expect a higher training of the canopies. So yeah, so I don't know. It's hard to. I would say rather than saying one village has kind of adapted more than others. I mean, you can say maybe some villages are more dynamic than others, but I think a lot of that just has to do with a coincidence. And what's really interesting is the breakdown of strong village identities.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be. I mean, the thing also, something to also consider is like for an average Burgundy buyer who's buying, you know, top domain wines, and then end up buying maybe like a, you know, a Clos de Baz or a Neshazo from someone who is making wine in a kind of more hands-off approach and lower sulfur, and hence the wine will be ready in 5-7 years. Not all, but sometimes, you know, you see, you know, with the lower level of sulfur. I don't think sulfur makes the wine age longer or less. It just depends on the vintage, the producer. But here I am. I'm buying Grand Cru Burgundy, and I'm paying top dollar, and then I buy a producer who might have you know, more of a hands-off approach, and the wine's ready earlier. But you have to know that. If you don't know that, you're like, oh, this wine tastes like good now, or I waited too long for it, or whatever the case may be. It's
for
hard
sure.
to, you know, but if you like to drink them young and fresh, I think, you know, the smaller appellations are where it's at. I mean, not that I consider Marsanne a smaller appellation, because there's one producer who is overperforming at the highest level, and tasting this Clos de Roi 17, you're just like, wow. I mean, this is and he's been doing it for so long. It's not even like he's new. It's like, you know, in context. Right. I mean, he's been killing it for as long as I remember, and visiting him is always like one of the top visits in Burgundy.
Yeah, if you can pin him down.
yeah, that too. Yeah, but the wine is so, like 70, so open. I mean,
yeah, and there's just super supple. I mean, that has to be one of the most, even in the context of wines that drink well young, it has to be one of the most immediately charming vintages he made to date. Yeah. But there's depths too. I mean, that's the thing about 17s, tasting them from barrel. A lot of them tasted a little fluid, and I definitely underestimated the 17s from barrel. So I rather underestimate a vintage than overestimate it, that's for sure. Yeah. But I bought a lot because it's Florence's birth vintage, and I'm just more and more happy to have huge amounts of them, honestly. Yeah, because they're going to be delicious for 30 years.
Yeah, I'm surprised. A lot of people, like, in the market, you can still find a lot of 17s around right now. I mean,
there was a lot of volume. Let's be honest as well. I mean, it was the biggest crop since probably 2000 or so. It was a really big yield, not the biggest since 1999 in Maurice Saint-Denis.
Interesting question here. Do the villages in Côte d'Or want to go organic, or is it just really hard to make that change? Hard question.
I mean, because we talk about a lot of producers in Burgundy, but a lot of producers we don't talk about. I mean, there must be 55 domains in Volnay alone, and we talk about 10 of them.
Yeah.
So if you go to the village meeting, and maybe if it was just the meeting of the 10 that we talk about, and you started saying we should all go organic, then you'd do great with the 10. But I think the other 40 might have things to say. You know, I think you could make yourself very unpopular. I mean, if you ask, I think if you look down in the Mâconnais, they with the Premier Cru, they wanted to outlaw machine harvesting in the Premier Cru. And there was no way that, you know, no one voted in favor of that. So I don't know. I think there's a lot more conservatism, and there's a lot more sort of deep-rooted attachment to sort of chemical farming here than people get the idea of, simply because, you know, they're not talking to all the producers that we don't talk about.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's not, you know, definitely like one nice good thing that some domains doing less extractions are rewriting rules of how the wine. Yeah, because it just depends. If you're gonna, you know, if you're gonna go full throttle and go for the cold soak, full on punch down, you know, and just the whole class 100% new oak, you're gonna get something very different than someone who's you know, like the Chantre style. It's like you can imagine Tomoko on the tank, you know, so,
which is not very heavy, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's just different than someone who's like, I mean, think like if Tomoko hires some like big dude coming to the punch down, the wine's different, right?
Well, that's what I said to Cécile Tremblay. I did a punch down for her once, and I said, you realize if the wine's over extracted, it's going to be my fault. I go through the cap like.
Yeah, no.
I mean, I was on the bottom practically.
Yeah. The question here: do you think the drinking window for Grand Cru wines has become earlier, and why? That's a good one. I like that.
Yeah, I think people are for sure extracting less. And I mean, that's very evident. And I think people have maybe also toned down the enzymatic extraction. I think that was one of the big things of the wines of the 90s that still marks them out. I mean, I think that there are some pretty extracted styles in Burgundy historically. I mean, like the old Michel Gonou wines, but they did come around if you aged them long enough. But I think some of the more sort of techno extracted wines of the 90s, where people were messing around with enzymes and heated post fermentation macerations and things, I wonder if those will ever come around, because it's sort of artificial extraction. But people are definitely doing a much less extraction. Then also the quality of the oak that people are getting, frankly, is a lot better, at least for the domains that know how to ask for it, are getting, and they're using less for sure, but also even people who are using 100% new, look at the quality of the oak that Rumier is getting now compared to 1999 vintage.
Yeah.
I mean, there's just much more refined. It's still a bit seasoned better and better toasted. And that's especially noticeable from Francois Frère, because I think they just expanded so fast in the 90s with the growing demand and this big vintage and everything. But so I don't know. I think just structurally the wines have less coarseness to them. Yeah, so there's less of a reason to wait, because you don't have to wait for the wines because then they taste nasty. Whether they're their full potential, even though you can drink them, is another question. I mean, there's some of these wines are so deceptively charming that you think a lot could come after 30 years for many of these wines as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's our palate changing. It's like, but I think what's happening more is that there's more producers inclusive. There's more styles inclusive. I'm happy to, have a little Gamay from Nicolas Faure.
Yeah.
And then the other day we had is Alos Corton. I mean, the intent is the same, but the appellation, the grape, I mean, that is what's very interesting now. And I think the values, as I said earlier, in the haute côte, that's a lot. It's a lot of good value wines coming out of the haute côte, and I think more to come.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, there's a lot more to be done there. Another thing we live with always in Burgundy in terms of vines is we live with the planting choices of 20 plus years before. Looking back at pricing of wines in 1996, you could understand why people would plant. Also, the climate, you could understand why people were planting the kinds of clones that a lot of people were planting back then. And now, I mean, people are much more interested in Mazal selections. If you see people doing interesting things with Mazal selections and higher density in the haute côte, that's going to be very exciting.
Yeah. Marco Peltier is here. Yeah, Marco, you come to Vente. Yeah, if you guys come into Vente, Vente has all the cool wines in the world.
Yeah, no, I know.
We'll have Marco here chatting in a week or so. So here's the question.
Oh, nice.
We rarely see celebrated wines from the vineyards between Fisson and Marsanne. Why is that?
Well, I think to be frank, I mean, this goes back to our discussion about appellations, and let's take a little step back and talk about scoring wine. I mean, it's maybe not the most interesting thing to talk about, but I have to do a lot of it. And just think about how the 100-point system or scoring in general was, when it was applied to Bordeaux in the 80s, was kind of an insurgent, disruptive force, because it disrupted the existing hierarchy of the 1855 classification. When you compare how scoring by journalists has been done in Burgundy, the tendency has actually just simply to be to reinforce the existing hierarchy. So, only Romanée Conti and Mouchigny can get 100 and so forth down the line. And that if you want to know why Marsanne and Fisson don't get higher, it's because of the system, And I think, of course, I mean, people say it's not sort of points driven. It's not, the wine market is not points driven, but still that has a lot of influence. And I certainly know that when I give a score that sort of smashes through those boundaries, say in the Mâconnais or the Chalonnais, I mean, that really means a lot to the producers down there. And I think it gives people a bit more confidence to take the wine seriously. And you see, I mean, the really tragic thing about the glass ceilings is the way you see producers who sort of start out, and I could think of maybe some in southern Burgundy who started out with really wanting to push things and change things up. Young guys, right? You know, who maybe now a little bit older, maybe they've got families, and you see them kind of slipping, you know, and you can tell tasting the wines that the yields have gone up, that the winemaking is maybe not as punctilious as it was. And this is just because they're not really getting validation, because, you know, no matter how hard you try in Macon Locher, you're not going to get more than 91 points, and you're not going to get treated seriously and put in the right place on the wine list to be treated seriously. I think in many ways, you have a much higher chance of being taken really seriously as kind of an elite wine, starting from scratch in a vineyard that never existed in California, than you do in the Mâconnais or the Côte Chalonnaise.
Yeah. Now, I know that you've given specifically one wine from the Macau a higher score than a lot of wines, a lot of Grand Crus, and I've also noticed that that you've given many Premier Cru wines from producing Grand Cru a lower score, and that is kind of out of mold, because no one does that. It's like if you have one producer, you have, you know, the Village is 90, the Premier Crus are 92 to 94. If you're generous, Grand Crus are, you know, above that. And I've seen you've kind of done the opposite. You've given Premier Crus, you know, much higher score than the Grand Cru, which is admirable.
Well, thank you. I really want to try to. I mean, it takes some confidence, and it flies in the face of a lot of people's expectations. A lot of people sort of, you know, I mean, there's a line from the philosopher Wittgenstein to the effect that sometimes there are some situations where you use rulers to measure the table, but sometimes the table is used to measure the ruler. And the appellation system is so powerful. I think it's more to there is an element whereby if I give a score like that, people will think, well, this guy's crazy. He's wrong because they can't be that good. And you see people in tastings correct themselves. They taste blind and they prefer the Pernod Premier Cru to the Coton Chalamet. And you reveal the bottles and like, oh no, I made a mistake. Well, you see, it's got more of this and that.
Oh yeah.
You know, I mean, I've probably done that myself. I'm sure everybody's done it. But it's just such a powerful cultural construct that it's hard to crack through it. But I do think that, at least potentially, the sort of way we write about wines could have the same kind of sort of positively disruptive force that it had in Bordeaux in the 80s.
Yeah, no, I mean for sure. And I don't rate wine or anything else, but I always rate wine by the drinkability. And I think it was like maybe last Christmas, I opened I think 4 or 5 2016 wines. And there was some Village, there was some Premier Cru, and some Grand Cru wines, and of the 6 or 7 wines, and it was fascinating because there were all kinds of people there. They were like serious wine drinkers, they were like just novices, and I'm like, what is the first bottle that gets drunk? You know, it's like, and you know, you see the first bottle, like I think I had a Chantreve wine, and that was the first bottle to get finished. And then the second wine was like a Village wine, but then the Grand Crus were almost half full because they were like, they were young also. They were young.
It's the sine qua non phenomenon.
Well, they were young, but it's fascinating. Anyway, so someone is asking, where do you get your fruit for your Burgundy wines?
I buy. It's all disclosed in the wine Advocate. The grapes come from Gilbert Feletic. So the Ludi is Les Fouchères, which is next to Les Boniques, sort of round the slope. You know, you've got Musigny, and then you go round the slope, and that sort of more north-facing slope towards the village, going towards the cemetery is all village, but a nice sector. I mean, there's no bad village wine in Chambol anyway, honestly.
Yeah.
It's just two barrels for fun, to learn.
To learn. I got to taste it.
Yeah, no, we bottled the first vintage with the Chèvre à Dubec, you know, with Koch style by hand. Nice. And with some nice corks, good bottles. And
great.
You know, but the 19 is better.
Great. I'm coming to taste it. Some question here: should we still trust Lafleur after oxidation issues? Oof, I don't know. I'm not going to touch that one because
Yeah,
I
that's
mean,
like,
it depends on your patience and your how much money you have to see
right.
what happens. I personally, first of all, the wines are too expensive for me to buy. I'm happy to taste them, happy to drink them. I don't know. I
It's a
can't answer
tricky
that question.
thing for journalists because, I mean, when you tasted Aaron Claude's wines from tank before bottling, obviously they're not oxidized before they're bottled. That happens later. So what's a journalist? I mean, people sometimes say, well, journalists haven't called out producers enough for problems with Premox. But I mean, all of my white Burgundy purchasing is organized around avoiding buying Premoxing wine. And I have maybe like a couple a year, and then it's like, it's on me because I made a mistake. But I very rarely open Premox bottles, and I don't want to. I want to avoid them. So I'm not going to publish articles from my own cellar about all my oxidized wines because I've actually done quite a good job in avoiding them.
Yeah.
It's a tricky one. The whole issue, I mean, I'm not buying them personally, but again, it's just an economic question
Yeah.
and a matter of opportunity cost.
That can be a whole 5-hour conversation, and I've spoken about that
Yes.
too much in my life. And so there's a comment on point system. I think for me, and you don't answer this. For me, I think point system is what it is, because I think people like to kind of measure things in some context.
Yeah.
But someone like William Kelley, who's writing about wine in a deep way, I think the writing is perhaps more important than the point system. The point system is just what you kind of fold into.
Yeah.
So
I hope so.
But the writing is the more important part, and kind of the knowledge you share on your writing is really good. Paul Wasserman, great comment. A brilliant Vaughn Village will always be more thrilling than a mere very good Vaughn Grand Cru, 100%. And that's another 1 hour conversation on that one.
For sure.
Yeah, no.
No, it's
Rafa Brett in the house.
oh, cool.
Excellent. Okay, let's take a look. Here's a good question. What lesser vintages do you feel people got wrong, or is purely producer Trump's vintage?
Oh, well, but for sure, I mean, we've got it in our glasses. 17 has been very underrated. Yeah. And this goes back to your point about scoring wines on drinkability. I mean, this was a big question that I sort of faced revisiting the 17s from bottle, because maybe from some sort of abstract intellectual perspective, 17s are not as serious as 16s or 15s. And maybe age 50, the 15s and 16s will still be young, and the 30s will be fully mature, and by age 40, the top 30s will be kind of, that's the time to start drinking them up, to finish them off. But I mean, 30 years, it's a long time. If the wine tastes brilliant for 30 years and delivers immense amount of pleasure, should it really be scored down? Because it's not as serious as 16. So and this has never really been defined, I don't think, by anybody writing about wine. We're going to have to sort of figure it out as we go along, more intuitively than theoretically. But 17 for sure is underrated. Huh?
Oh, for sure. And it'll be really fun, maybe in like 20 years, to kind of taste like 08, 14, 17.
13 too.
I mean, just kind of 13, of course. That's what 13. Just compare, because 14 is quite bony sometimes, and like 13s are also even more the last October harvest, and then 17 just charming, and
the issue will be
Paul is saying Becky Wasserman 66.
Yeah, well, I'd settle for that.
Yeah, Becky Wasserman compared to 66. It's pretty good.
I'd settle for that. Yeah. No, I mean, and I think the funny thing is that people underrated 17 reds and continue to do so. I think for a lot of people's palates, and especially the contemporary palate, people maybe overrated 17 whites a bit, because those are pretty ripe wines, and they're going to be pretty exotic aromatically in the sort of 1992 white Burgundy way, I suspect. And right now, they've just been bottled, and there's plenty of sulfur and what have you, and you don't see it. But I think the 17s are going to be more exotic and a bit more textural and fleshy than people expect. People who are looking for more like, sort of super tensile, lean 2014 style, bit of reduction. I don't think the 17 whites are going to kind of be that vintage. It's going to be more open, sun-kissed white Burgundy vintage than people anticipate.
Yeah. Yeah, you know, I mean, I remember I'm not comparing 99 to 17, but when the 99s in barrel, I remember a lot of wine critics were like, "Oh no, yields are too high. This vintage is not going to age,"
Yeah.
including very many of my dear friends. And I'm like, "No way! I've had this in barrel like 4 times now, and this is going to be one of the great vintages." And I said this in
Yeah.
2001. In those years, I've tasted them, and today I still stand by 99 being one of the great vintages of our lifetime. At least the
And
ones
for
I've tasted in
whites,
barrel.
I mean, the problem is that was in the nadir of Primox, but the best 1999 whites, I mean, the Conche 1999 whites, incredible wines, and when the Ramonet 1999s that aren't oxidized are brilliant.
Yeah, I mean, also there was a comment earlier about drinkability, but I mean, you know, there's a lot of people who in Burgundy are, you know, saying how little malic acid they have in the wines after fermentation. So mallows are
Yeah.
finishing earlier, so bottling slightly earlier, and then of course drinkability being. I mean,
Well,
those are
yeah,
like
you can go that way, but I think one of the things that interests me about in these very warm vintages is pushing elevage further, even if the malic acid isn't there. You know, just to get some sort of biochemical stability to the wines, and it seems to be that the wines can pick up acidity or pick up the perception of acidity and from long elevage. I mean, my 2019, I think I'm going to do 2 years in barrel.
yeah.
And you know, and again, look at look at '05 whites. I mean, practically the only good '05 whites were made by people who do long elevage for whites. And look at the Corsh '05 whites. That was what was possible in '05, but just people didn't have the combination of
Yeah,
dry extract, enough acidity,
yeah,
and then long elevage is kind of exciting.
yeah, for sure. I mean, and whites, I think whites need long élevage. I think it's just, I mean, for me personally, I always think
Yeah.
that the whites need it longer than red. But let's talk of your wines you're tasting right now. Give us a little synopsis of what you're tasting and what are your thoughts on the wines you
Yeah.
open.
Oh well. So I've got the patin in my glass, but before I was so I have the advantage on you because it's almost 10 p.m. here. So I've been working on these
Yeah,
for
yeah,
some
yeah, yeah.
time.
Oh yeah,
I just tasted. This is the latest Dora Gential Mikado Vievine 2018 vines from 1917. I think 4 generations of the family have farmed that same parcel now, and all organic, and I mean, very innovative viticultural guy. Good friends with some folks at Loire. He's a neighbor of somebody who's works at Loire. And, nobody in Rui is doing things like that. And this wine, you put into a blind tasting with top wines from the Côte d'Or, I mean, it would destroy a lot of them. A lot of very expensive wines. And you just sort of see, you know, how much harder it is for somebody like him. And okay, he's got a bit of sort of celebrity status in the French restaurant scene. So I think that, he's not suffering and struggling particularly. But it's so much more difficult for him with wines of that quality than it is with somebody machine harvesting in Pouligny. So that's exciting. I think also got the 18s from Bruno Laurenson, who is another person who I think doesn't get enough press, and I think he was with Martins for a little while in the US, wasn't he? But he hasn't had sort of incredibly good US representation, and I think I mean that even from the beginning of the domain bottling movement, the US has been such an important market for Burgundy and shaping global perceptions of which domains are important in Burgundy. So it's really critical. I always try to explain to producers, like especially young producers, you need to pick your US representation very, very carefully because this will have a decisive impact on how your wines are perceived everywhere. And he's somebody whose wines merit so much more attention. And then the reds too. It's just, again, you're just pushing the boundaries of what's possible down there in these places that most people have never even heard of. And you look at the books about Burgundy and you read things like wines from the Fritz cannot really gain complexity and are best drunk in the first 5 years. And that's a book published in the last 15 years. I mean, how can people say things like that, really?
yeah.
So I feel sorry for these guys out there breaking their backs and tractors and trying to do justice to their wines. So I mean, I can't go and visit anybody at the moment, so, but I'm tasting everything pretty much that I normally would at home, because people are dropping off the bottles and what have you. So I'm happy to be still able to cover their wines.
Yeah, I still go back to the Pad Thai. I mean, the Chantreve is incredible. That's I've had that wine several times, but the 17 Le Clou is very, very. I mean, the most uniquely different wine.
Yeah, and that's my big. You know that Prairie Rock will not receive any journalist ever. Even on the even if you say it's just for personal interest, I'm not going to write about the wines. So it's the one estate in Burgundy that I never visited, that I would really like to visit.
Yeah. And you have a Chantreve also?
I do not. In fact, the virus, I was due to go and pick up a case just before lockdown started, just after lockdown started, in fact. So along with that and repairing my car, the two things that I didn't get done just before the lockdown, which would have been advantageous. I could have done with a functioning car and some more bottles in the cellar. But I taste. I think was it the 17. I think I tasted. I did taste that wine end of last year. Or the 18 and the 18 of it too. They did a really good job in 18, I think.
And what? Yeah, it's just such soulful wines, Also, and what is your opinion on the 18 vintage overall?
I was very excited about it when I was making my little cuve and seeing the reds, just because it was just very impressive. There's so much color straight away, and the wines in Chambol that have the same tannin index as things like 2000 Chateau Latour, without any punch downs, just macerated. So it's kind of was very striking and impressive, and just in a sort of imposing way. But tasting the wines from barrel, not many gave me many emotions, let's say. So I was on balance, I would say 18 as a whole across the Côte d'Or left me a little cold. I mean, there's some brilliant wines, but that's the case every year, right? So I don't know. Did you taste many yet? What was your view?
Yeah, it's a very unusual event for me. There was a lot of dry extract. I could not.
Huge.
I could not understand them. They were very. Again, I only tasted with the 4 or 5 people, so I didn't taste as much as you did. But I was going to come and taste it in May this year.
Oh, okay.
Just to kind of taste them end of élevage or bottled, mostly bottled, but. I guess I'll taste them later, and I'll read your stuff and get an idea. Because at this point, I'm I'll buy from these guys who I'm tasting right now.
Right.
I don't I can't go and buy a case of Rousseau Claude de Bez anymore, so I'll rely on
unless the virus crisis really does shake things up.
Yeah, I don't think so. Burgundy.
I don't think so either. No.
Well, William, thank you so much for chatting.
Hey.
We covered
no worries.
just the tip of the iceberg, and I can't wait to be with you very soon. And,
likewise, we got some 72s waiting for you.
I know. I'm gonna come. I'm gonna come.
I buried them in a corner, so I can't drink them.
Yeah, I'm trust me. I'll ask. I'm gonna, I'll come. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot. Cheers.